Hi, I'm Patrick Scott, and welcome to PLS 101, American Democracy and Citizenship. Today we're going to be talking about public opinion and political participation. We're going to be covering topics such as the various factors that shape your political attitudes and the various factors that also influence your voting patterns. As you might know, public opinion is obviously a very important topic. You always hear during campaigns and elections that are going on, politicians are always trying to check on the opinion polls about who's ahead in the races. But even outside of your campaign and election cycles, public opinion still plays a very important role. Congress, for example, might be very much interested in knowing whether or not the public, for example, supports fundamental health care reform or Social Security reform. And so because of that, public opinion is a very important topic to be considered. In many ways, as far as the president is concerned, public opinion is in large measure related to his popularity. It reminds me of the fact that when Bill Clinton was in the process of being impeached, he was still enjoying a favorableness rating of about 60%. And so the level of popularity of a president, which is reflected in public opinion, can be a very important power in terms of the president's ability to persuade others to accomplish his agenda. And that's why politicians are very sensitive to public opinion. Now, well, what is public opinion? What I want to do this week is to discuss some aspects of public opinion, look at what public opinion is, and examine how public opinion is formed. First, as you may probably know, people are by and large ignorant about politics, but they're also more than happy to give their opinion about politics and political issues. And in fact, there have been several studies where researchers have asked people to give their opinion about perhaps some kind of bogus piece of legislation or some kind of bogus news item, and the people are more than happy to respond with their opinion. A specific example that comes to mind is a study conducted by researchers from the University of Cincinnati, and they were asking people in Ohio what was their view about something called the Monterey Control Bill. And there was no such thing as a Monterey Control Bill. But yet many people had responded, well over half had registered either a favorable or unfavorable opinion about the Monterey Control Bill. Other polls have shown that very few people know basic information like things about, like, for example, who is the vice president or who is the Secretary of Defense. So, given this level of ignorance, how much faith should we put in public opinion polls? Well, they are important, but again, we also have to take them with a grain of salt. Especially those opinion polls that ask people about defense policy or the views of the Supreme Court or even the views of presidential candidates. Again, how much do people know about these? Sometimes, again, you have to take the results that you see with a grain of salt. So, one problem with opinion polls, first of all, is that people are often not very knowledgeable about the issues. And secondly, even where people may be knowledgeable about the issues, how the question is worded can dramatically affect the answer that people provide. Now let me give you an example of this. This actually happened years ago, and I actually remember seeing this. I received in the mail a poll from the Moral Majority. The Moral Majority was an organization that was created by Jerry Falwell back in the early 1980s. And our residents received a poll from the Moral Majority, and that poll asked the following question about, is it related to abortion? If you think about this question here, are you for the slaughter of innocent babies? Well, overwhelmingly, I would think that 99.99% would say, if not 100%, would say no. Now, take that question, because it really relates to abortion. Take that question and compare it to this. Do you think a woman should have the right over her own body when it comes to matters of reproductive freedom? I think you're not going to get a 100% response like you did the first question. So again, how you word the question. Some questions can be biased and obviously, therefore, may dramatically affect the answer that you get. A third problem that pertains to public opinion is that opinions can change dramatically over time. They are not stable, sometimes not firmly held. So at one point in time when you're taking a poll among the public about a particular issue, you may find that it may shift or change over time as new events occur. And the point here is that some opinions and some viewpoints are pretty stable, others are a little bit more fickle. And it's very important, for example, a politician kind of understand the difference between which are more firmly held views versus which ones might vacillate from one week to the next. But in short, public opinion has at least three flaws or three shortcomings. Ignorance, oftentimes on the part of the voter, stability in opinions over time, and potential problems with the way the question may be worded. Okay. So those are some potential problems with public opinion polls, and again, the need to make sure that you kind of understand when you're looking at a poll, look at how the question is worded. Look at, again, see who's the ones who are surveyed, and try to assess, see, again, kind of understand what's their general level of knowledge. In addition to that, another topic that researchers look at in terms of public opinion and trying to assess public opinion is the idea of various underlying dimensions of public opinion. In fact, researchers have identified 4 key underlying dimensions of public opinion. Those 4 underlying dimensions are intensity, salience, stability, and direction. The questions that these pertain to, or the ideas that these pertain to, are as follows. How intensely do you feel about a particular issue? How does it affect your life personally? That's the saliency part. And is your opinion on this issue likely to change over time? Now let me give you an example, because a lot of times you may think, for example, with intensity and saliency, make sure we understand the differences between the two. Oftentimes, intensity as a concept and saliency as a concept often are positively correlated. That is, they move in the same direction. If you feel intensely about something, it's also very salient to you. And oftentimes that can be the case. You can feel very intensely about something, and also your feelings are generated by the fact that it's relevant to your own personal life. But at the same time, I think I should point out too that there's sometimes you can feel very intensely about something, but it not directly affect you personally. So in other words, something could be very strong or high on intensity, but low on saliency. All right, so let me give you an example of that. Let's say that you happened to see a documentary the other day. You're watching perhaps something about businesses who were leaving the United States, shipping jobs down south, setting up shop in Mexico. And one of the things you found about one particular plant perhaps was this plant that had relocated to Mexico was polluting a massive amount of, discharging a lot of pollution into the environment, maybe particularly in terms of into the water table. And so because of that, you also see in terms of this report, in this documentary, you may find that the cancer rates in this area were so much higher than the cancer rates in other parts of the country. And the number of miscarriages and the percentages of women who were having miscarriages were much higher here, who were located close to this plant, than the rest of the country. And so the argument perhaps that you had seen in this documentary was that this plant was obviously bad for the environment in this area of Mexico, and it was bad for the health of the people. And you felt very, very bad about that, and you felt very strongly that this is not right, that plants should not go and move to other countries where they may have more lax environmental pollution controls and thereby affect the health of the local population. So that's an issue perhaps where you could feel very intensely about, but at the same time not be necessarily very salient to you because you're not from that area. There's another issue here. Let me give you the opposite of that. There can be some issues that are very, very salient to you, but you don't feel necessarily very intensely about them. Let's say, for example, that the Board of Governors of the Missouri State University are thinking about increasing the your tuition by 3% next year. Well, that's something that's very, very salient to you, obviously. But do you feel intensely about it? Probably not, because you say, well, 3%, as bad as it may be to you and affect your pocketbook, at the same time you realize that, well, the cost of living may be 3% or roughly around the same amount, so that may be an issue where that's very, very salient, but you don't feel very intensely about. Okay. When we talk about the other two dimensions, stability, the idea there is how stable is your opinion over time? And the point that I want to share with you on this is that some opinions, again, shift quite dramatically, especially those that we have very, very little knowledge of. And as we get more knowledge over time, our opinions may change on them as they become more informed. Other opinions, however, are very, very deep-seated opinions that reflect our own worldviews about things. And obviously, it's common sense here to suggest that those kinds of issues that tap into your core values, your core beliefs, when someone's asking you questions about those core values and beliefs, those are obviously not going to change over time. They're much more stable over time as opposed to other issues of which you have less knowledge of. And then the last dimension, the idea of direction, is very, very self-explanatory, and that is if you're doing an opinion poll, what is the overall direction of public opinion on an issue? Are people by and large for an issue or opposed to an issue? That's the idea behind the idea of direction. Do most people or most Americans favor or oppose gun control legislation, as an example? Up to this point, we've been talking about different dimensions of public opinion and different aspects and why it's important, for example, for politicians. And we've also talked about, of course, some of the shortcomings of public opinion polls in terms of being able to assess how people really feel. What I want to do now is shift gears a little bit and talk about some of the origins of political attitudes. Why do you believe what you believe? All of us acquire a set of political attitudes and we form opinions about social issues. This process is something known as political socialization. It's the idea that over time we begin to form opinions about our political system. So it's a process, and that's why it's called political socialization. It's a socializing process. And it's something that doesn't occur overnight, but over time we form and develop and reinforce certain viewpoints about the world around us. And that certainly applies with respect to our political world as well. So what I want to talk about here is what are some of the primary agents of socialization. All right, so when I say agents of political socialization, what I'm really saying is at the same time is what are some of the various origins of your political attitudes. We're talking about the same thing here. Number one, probably the most important agent of political socialization or origin of your political attitudes is the family. The family is probably one of the most important factors that shape the formation of your own attitudes. Why is that? Well, as you know, families transmit basic attitudes, beliefs, and values that mold your view of the world. And so as an example, our parents often play a major role in influencing our political party affiliation. As the text notes, for example, that loyalty to a political party tends to be passed down from one generation to the next. If we were having a live classroom discussion right now, I'd probably actually ask you to raise your hand and tell me how many people out there in TV land belong to a political party and that is the same of their parents. And overwhelmingly what I would see is that most people would raise their hands in this class because they tend to have the same political party affiliation as their parents. And sometimes, of course, your parents are not the same, but if your parents have the same political party, chances are you're going to have the very same political party as well. You're more in the minority if you have adopted a different party from both of your parents, even at the college level. But that is, political party affiliation does play a major role. I remember, and you can think about this when you were younger too, when you first heard about politics maybe and how your parents viewed politics. If your parents did in fact talk about politics, and they may not have, but if they had, and how they felt about different candidates and different parties. And I remember even when I was 8 years old, I remember there were donkeys and there were elephants. And my dad was voting for a candidate, Richard Nixon, who was an elephant. And if my dad liked elephants, then I should like elephants too. And so I remember way back then, I remember that influence of my father and his views about political parties and politics. So certainly the parents play a major role in terms of shaping the formation of your political attitudes way back early on. And as part of that, another principal way by which the family transmits political beliefs, of course, is by your religious tradition. Because your religious upbringing can definitely influence your views about politics and reinforce the other messages about politics that you're getting from your family. And let me just give you a quick example of that. Let's look at the example, the differences between, say, Catholics, Protestants, and Jews in terms of political party affiliation. By and large, let's look at, for example, economic issues right now. We can look at economic issues and social issues, but let's just right now focus on economic issues. On economic issues, we would probably say that Protestant families tend to be the most conservative on economic issues by and large, followed by Catholics. They tend to be more liberal than Protestant families on economic issues, and then followed by Jewish families, which tend to be much more liberal than either Protestants or Catholics on economic issues. And in part, that explains historically why Catholics and Jews have historically supported the Democratic Party more so than the Republican Party. Now, on social issues, it's a little bit different, more of a mixed thing, particularly because of the issue of abortion. So you don't see quite the same breakout on social issues, but generally speaking, we can say that on social issues, Protestant and Catholics tend to be more conservative than Jewish families with respect to social issues. Jewish families tend to register much more of a liberal tradition and therefore more support for say, democratic policies in the past because of that. Okay, so what do we have here? What shapes your political attitudes? What are the different agents of political socialization? We have your family. We have your religion. Okay, what else? What are other factors that shape the formation of your own political attitudes? Well, certainly another one would be gender. Whether you're male or female, your gender may influence how you feel about some political issues. Let me give you an example here. During the 1950s, women were more likely to be Republican than men, but since the late 1960s, women are more likely to be Democratic than men overall, all things being equal. And why is this? Well, what researchers have suggested is that in part the reason for the shift of more women for the Democratic Party is due to the shift in party positions that are important to women. Women care about issues, for example, like gun control, poverty, hunger, drug abuse, and the Democratic Party tends to support positions that women also agree upon in these areas. Okay, so that's one of the reasons why. Well, what about abortion? Are you going to find gender differences? Do women tend to feel differently about abortion than men? Be careful about this one, because your first reaction might be, well, yeah, of course, women tend to be more pro-choice than men, and men are more pro-life. Not necessarily at all. In fact, surprisingly, there are no strong differences between men and women on the issues of abortion. In other words, you're going to find just as many men and just as many women proportionally who are in favor of abortion as those who oppose abortion. In other words, you cannot find a gender as a variable that breaks out differences between men and women on that issue. And you see the same thing with respect to support, for example, the Equal Rights Amendment, which was a proposed amendment to the Constitution that has not really gotten much traction, but the idea that there should be no discrimination on the basis of gender. Again, you might think that women would be far more in favor of the Equal Rights Amendment than men, but like abortion, that doesn't really separate the genders between the two in terms of their differences. Just as many women as men support, just as many women as men proportionally are opposed to the Equal Rights Amendment. So there are some differences, largely in terms of support for the Democratic Party, that you see that women tend to express their opinions on more so than men. But on other issues that you might think you might see differences, those differences are really not there. Now, besides family, religion, and sometimes gender, another important factor, education. Again, going back to the idea of your political socialization, elementary schools, when you're first going to school, they play a major role here. In most every country, the elementary schools have played a major part in indoctrinating children into the basic values of their respective political systems. That's no different from here in the United States. Early on, we're taught to say the Pledge of Allegiance. We learn about Washington chopping down the cherry tree and telling his father that he cannot tell a lie. We see about Abraham Lincoln and what a great president he was. And these are some of the basic stories that reflect values and about who we are as a country. And so we hear about these early on. But beyond that, early on, that education, that training and so forth, and this influence is about, being ingrained about the importance of being a citizen and the importance of voting and those kinds of things. Attending college actually has a very big impact on your political attitudes as well. Studies have shown that attending college has what I would call a liberalizing effect on your attitudes, especially when it concerns such matters as civil liberty, foreign policy, and social issues. Now, when I say it has a liberalizing effect, I'm not saying that going to college means that you come out of college as a bleeding heart liberal by any means, and that's not what I mean at all. But I'm saying that there is a bit of a liberalizing tendency that does affect how you view the world. In fact, these same studies have shown that college students are more liberal in their political beliefs than the general population as a whole. They've done surveys that have compared college students to the general public, and they have shown on a lot of core issues, college students register more liberal beliefs. Students at the most prestigious colleges tend to be the most liberal of all. As you might expect, students who attend universities are more likely to express liberal positions or be more liberal in their orientation than students who attend community colleges. Okay? What about length of time in college? Does that have an effect? In other words, do seniors tend to express more liberal positions than the first-year students? Not surprisingly, the answer is yes. The longer students stay in college, the more liberal they tend to become in terms of their political beliefs. Seniors tend to be more liberal than first-year students, and graduate students tend to be more liberal than undergraduate students. Okay. And even another study looked at students who were majoring in the social sciences versus the hard sciences like physics or engineering, and they found that those in the social sciences tend to have more of a liberal position than those in the hard sciences. So now, what does all this mean? Does this mean that going to college, why does going to college affect your political beliefs? Do you think this is a plot among professors to make you all liberal? I hope you don't think that. Of course not. I think the real answer here is going to school exposes people to more information about politics from all sources. Again, college students, when compared to high school students or the public as a whole, often with the same age group, college students tend to read more newspapers, join more organizations, and they tend to participate much more in the political process. And that gives them an exposure to a broader array of information, and it challenges them in their thinking. So that's the key here, is by simply being exposed to a wider array of information, by being exposed to people from other backgrounds than your own when you were growing up, and having the opportunity to discuss different viewpoints among people who have different backgrounds and viewpoints, that has a way of challenging your beliefs. And because of that, it does have a tendency to have a bit of a liberalizing effect. Again, that does not mean that if you're conservative, starting out, you're going to not stay conservative. You can very well graduate very, very conservative. But again, as a general tendency, there is a bit of a liberalizing effect. All right, and again, I wouldn't take it too far, because it doesn't mean that you're going to come out as a flaming or bleeding heart liberal, as people like to describe liberals sometimes, by going to college by any means. All right, but again, the point here is just being exposed to more sources of information and challenging, and at a time in your life too, by the way, in which you're being challenged in some of your belief systems. Again, it tends to have this bit of a liberalizing effect. So certainly education has a role in terms of shaping your political attitudes. Other factors. What about race? If you are Caucasian versus Hispanic versus African American, is there a difference because of race? If we look at, or ethnic background. If we look at differences, for example, between whites and African Americans, we see a number of differences and a number of similarities. In fact, there are many issues. Again, let's just look right now at African Americans and Caucasians. There are many similarities. For example, both believe in the need for the police to get rid of crime in drug-infested neighborhoods. They both have similar views regarding prayer in public schools. Both groups have similar attitudes regarding abortion. So a lot of issues in which you'll find a lot of agreement. But where you'll find the biggest differences between whites and African Americans often goes back to the same as between women and men, and that is support for the Democratic Party. African Americans tend to identify overwhelmingly with the Democratic Party, partly because of the historical differences between the parties, but even more recently because of the Democratic Party within the last 40, 50 years and its view about trying to achieve greater equality in society. Now, the identification with the Democratic Party has weakened a little bit over time, but again, overwhelmingly, African Americans will tend to vote much more Democrat than they will Republican. And again, the reason why is because the Democratic Party tends to favor greater government intervention in resolving social and economic issues. And most African Americans tend to support that view as well. Okay, so that's the reason why you would tend to have a tendency to see African Americans identify overwhelmingly with the Democratic Party. Another factor besides race and gender and education and family and religion is geographic region. Depending upon where you're from, does that also have an effect in terms of shaping your political attitudes? And of course, the answer there is yes. The traditional conception used to be like the North versus the South. The North was liberal and the South was conservative. But on the other hand, those differences are beginning to erode a little bit. And what you tend to see, for example, is more of a rural-urban split. You tend to see, for example, people in rural areas, regardless of being from the North or from the South or the East or the West, if you happen to be living in a rural area, you'll tend to be more conservative in your orientation. If you're from more of an urban area, you'll tend to register more of a liberal or Democrat, in some cases a Democratic orientation. So because of that, Democrats have been strong in urban areas. Traditionally, they also used to be strong in the South, but that was because of some different reasons with respect to the Civil War. While Republicans have been strong in the Midwest. And of course, Republicans are now strong in the South as well because of what's been happening here since probably the last 30 years or so. It used to be that the South was solidly Democrat, again, stemming back from the Civil War. And even though there were Southern conservatives and conservative Democrats, it was still a Democratic Party. It's like almost as if it were a one-party region. What we have seen over the last 30 years is a shift from a one-party region to another one-party region, because it's almost within a very relatively short period of time, the ideology of many Southerners began to line up with their political party affiliation. And so consequently, more and more Southerners have now come to identify more, who are certainly conservative, tend to identify more with the Republican Party than they do the Democratic Party. All right. So geographic region certainly does have some role here to play. Oftentimes, though, other factors tend to wash out those effects of regional differences. And so again, I think probably if you see any kind of regional differences, it's more of an urban versus rural as opposed to a North versus South or Midwest versus Southwest, those kinds of variables there. Now, so those are some of the various factors that influenced and shaped the formation of our political attitudes. These are some of the agents of political socialization. And we could probably come up with some others as well. Those are some of the most important ones. And as you might recognize, they all don't work in the same way together at the same time. And so probably the most important might very well be your family and your religion, because they shape your basic worldview. But certainly education plays a very important role as well. And when you take all these factors working together, you see that they all have sort of some factors may pull you in one direction, other factors or agents may kind of pull you in a different direction. And that's why it's really hard to say, well, tell me where you're from and I can tell you what you are, because there's so many other factors that actually do come into play here. Another thing that we should talk about besides the origins of political attitudes is a topic related to that called political culture. If you think about the idea of culture, each country has their own distinct cultures. Well, cultures or subcultures is part of that. Politics is a very important, maybe you could look at it as being a very important subculture of our overall larger culture of American society. When political scientists talk about culture, they talk about and talk about political culture, what they're looking at are the different things that we believe as, by and large, as citizens of our country that shapes how we view political life and how politics should be carried out. And again, these are things that we take advantage, we tend to take for granted, but recognize the fact that the political culture that we see in the United States is very different from the political culture you'll find in other countries. But basically what this is essentially is a set of shared values, beliefs, traditions. It consists of fundamental assumptions about how the political process should operate. And the political culture that we grow up in has a profound influence on our belief about politics and government. Now, there are several different elements of political culture, and I'll talk about those here, that at least some of the more important elements of our political culture. And some of these are actually pretty self-explanatory and fairly easy to go through. But for example, one important element of our political culture, one thing that we all believe in as Americans, is this idea of individual liberty. We believe that liberty is very important. It goes all the way back to the founding of our country. You know, the founding fathers fought for our hard-won liberties. And the idea here that we can define it today is that Americans believe that they should be free to pretty much do whatever they want to do as long as they don't hurt other people. That's the idea behind individual liberty. You can pursue liberty. Liberty and the pursuit of happiness goes hand in hand. Now, along with the idea of individual liberty, however, also is accompanied by the idea of individual responsibility. And that is, you're responsible for your actions and for your own well-being. We believe that by and large that people ought to be responsible for what they do. And you often hear this reflected in news stories or people's comments about this, is that of late you hear people talking about playing the role of victim. And that really tends to rub Americans the wrong way. They don't like the idea of people playing the role of victim or being a victim, you know, because that goes against the grain of their belief about individual responsibility. If people are in bad situations, you know, again, some things you certainly can't have any control over, but by and large the idea is that you're responsible for your own welfare. You're responsible for your own actions and not other people on your behalf. That's the idea behind individual responsibility. It's kind of the idea of pulling yourself up by your own bootstraps. That's part of the same kind of notion of this idea of individual responsibility. Now, a third one, a very important element of our political culture is this notion of equality. We all believe in equality. And part of that I want to talk about is two different dimensions or underlying subsets of equality. I want to talk about political equality and economic equality. All right? Now, let's talk about political equality first. The idea is this, is that everyone should have an equal vote and an equal chance of having their views heard. Your vote should not count more than mine, right? It's one person, one vote principle. As a democracy, if we're registered to vote, my vote shouldn't be worth twice as much as your vote by any means. It should all be the same. That's the idea of equality. But of course, in reality, do some people have more influence over our political system than others? And of course the answer is yes. Often those who have more money to spend on influencing the outcomes of public policies or campaigns and elections obviously have more weight, more pull than those who have less money to spend. So even though on the one hand we believe in political equality, we also recognize that there's a fair amount of inequality as part of that. But nonetheless, it's still a very important principle that we all believe very strongly in. All right? Now, I bring that up because I also want to point out how that contrasts with the idea of economic equality or inequality. Now, the idea of economic, think about this as Americans. Do we believe that a person, if they are a hard worker, should be able to rise up and become a millionaire through their own ingenuity and their own efforts and their own labors? If you work hard and you do this, do you have the right to become a millionaire? And of course we say absolutely, that's part of our free enterprise capitalistic system. And that's a good thing. That's what helps to drive our country and to help achieve prosperity all across our country. So this idea, but what I want you to suggest to you about this is that, well, what happens if one person, two people start off in the same, same upbringing and everything. One person makes decisions that allow them to end up being a millionaire. Somebody else makes some bad decisions and they end up being very, very poor. That might be considered an example of economic inequality. You've got two individuals with the same background, same education, same opportunities, But those opportunities, one person took better advantage of them than the other person did, and they ended up in two very, very different stages in their life, two different points in their life at the end. The point here is that we as Americans understand that economic inequality is something that it can be a good thing. We are certainly very willing to tolerate economic inequality. And in fact, interestingly, we are certainly more willing to tolerate economic inequality than political inequality. Now, I give you a contrast because people in many European nations believe that the principle of equality should apply fairly equally to both economic and political life. They are much less willing to tolerate economic inequality than people here in America are. All right? But again, I think the reason why, in part, we believe more strongly, or we're much more tolerant of economic inequality, is because it goes back to that notion of individual responsibility. You pull yourself up by your own bootstraps, by your own efforts, by what you do, that strong, rugged individualism, that kind of undercurrent throughout our collective national psyche. As we pull ourselves up and do what we do, if we're successful, then the system should reward us for being successful. Okay? Now, also in terms of the idea of economic equality, sometimes people talk about equality of opportunity and equality of results. Okay? And again, let me just point that out as well. We're much more as a country willing to say that people ought to have the same opportunities. All right? We believe more strongly in equality of opportunity, but we're also very much willing to tolerate differences in terms of equality of results. So in other words, we believe in equality of opportunity, but we don't necessarily believe in equality of results. We don't believe that people who start, like if you think about a racetrack and they're starting at the very beginning, they finish the race differently because one's a stronger runner than the other. That's quite okay. We don't believe necessarily that the person who started at the back should finish the race tied up with the person who started at the front, or who came out first. So that's the idea around the idea of equality of opportunity versus equality of results. We believe that it's a good thing to provide greater opportunities, greater equality of opportunity, but not necessarily equality of results. Okay. Now, beyond equality, let's talk about some other issues that are part and parcel of our political culture. Faith in democracy, pretty self-explanatory. We believe in government of the people, by the people, and for the people. Those that we elect should be accountable to us for their decisions. It's part of that notion of republic or representative democracy. We believe that democracy is the best type of political system, and that we as a right, again, going back to the idea of consent of the governed, if rulers don't make decisions on our behalf or that reflect what we want, then we have the right to replace that government with people or representatives who will do a better job in representing our viewpoints. Okay, so that's faith in democracy. Civic duty kind of goes hand in hand with this, and that is Americans ought to take community affairs seriously and help out when they can. It's the idea of voting, playing a role as in terms of your civic duties and responsibilities means, being a good citizen, playing by the rules, being informed on issues that are relevant to your community, and participating in those kinds of issues, and in the debates surrounding those issues. Being aware, being informed, playing a role here. That's the idea behind civic duty and what some people might say is responsible citizenship. Taking your responsibilities as a citizen of a particular system, political system, very, very seriously. That we're all in this together, and that we all have an obligation, and understand that we all have an obligation to play a role, an active role in that system. Another example of our political culture, another element, is something known as political efficacy. And we've talked about this before. But this is the idea, political efficacy is the idea of the ability of the average citizen to have an impact on government. And that is the idea, the sort of the dream that you often hear about when you're a child, that, my child's going to grow up and be president one day, or my child's going to be on the Supreme Court. It's the idea that everyone can aspire and play an active role here and have an impact. And most Americans believe that every citizen should have a chance to hold public office. And as we talked about in the discussion about federalism Federalism is one of the advantages of federalism is that because there are so many different opportunities to participate at so many different levels, that there are plenty, because you have so many opportunities, this enhances people's sense of political efficacy. And there have been some studies that have looked at this too, and people who grow up in households where politics is discussed, where parents have played an active role in the political system, where they've taken their civic responsibilities seriously, those children have a higher sense of political efficacy than other children who've grown up in households where you never talked about politics, you never discussed these issues, parents never played any kind of role in the political system. So you've got two kids that come out of two different households. One has a greater sense of political efficacy than the other. And what political scientists, of course, believe is that we need to have more and more people having a strong sense of political efficacy, because that's good for our democracy. That nurtures our democracy, and by contrast, when those who don't play a role in our political system, when those who feel alienated from our system, those who feel disenfranchised and not connected to our system, those who express the idea of saying, well, I'm not going to vote because I'm just voting for one set of crooks over to replace another. You hear those kinds of attitudes. You know, I don't want to have to bother to get involved. I'm more concerned about who's going to be on American Idol than I am about the issues of the day, kinds of things. You know, that can actually, nothing's wrong with American Idol, of course, but in terms of the idea about having a bit of a revulsion or hesitation to be involved, that is not good for our political system. And that has again, the more and more people that have disgusted politics and who choose not to participate in the system, that can be bad for democracy. It can have a corroding effect. And by the way, I'll say this, I'm going to say this again later too, but you know, I often hear people say, well, I'm not going to play a role in our political system because my vote doesn't count, or it doesn't really matter, or I'm voting for one set of crooks over replacing another set of crooks. You know, so therefore I choose not to play any role. Well, interestingly, I'll just say this right now, and again, I'll repeat it again later. If you choose not to play a role in our political system, then don't complain when the political system doesn't respond to what you want. In other words, if you want the system to respond to your views, to your values, to your wants and your needs, then you've got to play a role. If you don't play a role, then you've got no right to complain. That's my argument that I would suggest to you here. Don't expect the political system to actually incorporate or consider your viewpoints if you're not doing anything trying to influence the political system, because it doesn't need to. It's got plenty of other actors that are out there that are going to respond, that are playing a role in trying to influence government, and government's responding to those things. That's the idea that I was talking to you before about this notion of the pluralist model of government that we have here. And the idea that playing a role often means organizing into groups and channeling your viewpoints and playing an active role in government in general. When you do that, government's obviously going to be much more likely to respond and to your viewpoints. But that's the idea behind political efficacy. And again, that's something that political scientists feel very, very strongly about. A last one that I'll talk about here in terms of political culture, in terms of elements of political culture, is this idea of political tolerance. Are we tolerant of the views of other people? This is the idea, but political tolerance is the idea that we should be tolerant of the rights of others to have a say in the political process. We should be tolerant of the views of people who may disagree with our views. And of course, this involves concepts such as freedom of speech, majority rule, and the right to express your viewpoints, the right to circulate petitions, those kinds of things. Now, over the past several years, we have grown, I think, somewhat more tolerant. I mean, think about this. Back in 1960, when John F. Kennedy was running for president against Richard Nixon, John F. Kennedy won, but there was a lot of concern about John F. Kennedy. Do you remember why people were concerned about John F. Kennedy? Because he was Catholic. They were scared about having a Catholic in the White House. Why were they scared about having a Catholic in the White House? Many people were concerned that the president would be beholden to the Vatican, to the Pope. In other words, the idea that the Vatican would be the one running our country as opposed to the president. Now, today, does anyone have a concern about a Catholic being in the White House? Very, very, very minimal. Obviously, that's changed over time. Americans are obviously more willing to vote for a Catholic, for a Jew, for an African American, or a woman for president than they were several years ago. I mean, you think about the election of Barack Obama, Barack Hussein Obama for that matter. The point being here is that 20 years ago, Barack Obama would have not even had a chance. Maybe 30 years ago, even more so, even less of a chance. So we can see how today people are much more willing to vote for people who have different origins than perhaps they may themselves, the voters are, and I think that reflects an increasing level of tolerance in our society. And today, for example, if, for example, the gay and lesbian community wanted to have a march downtown, the average citizen would probably not try to prevent that march from going on, all right? On the other hand, interestingly, the average citizen would still oppose the idea of certain groups, for example, the Ku Klux Klan or neo-Nazis, from having a march downtown. So the reason why I say this is because, in other words, we have grown increasingly tolerant as a society, but we continue to remain intolerant of intolerance. And I remember, for example, even when I was going to school up in upstate New York, at Syracuse University, small town outside of Syracuse, town of Auburn, New York. This is where it was a major historical point for the Underground Railroad, which was helped to transport slaves to freedom, and as they were leaving the South to go into the North. Auburn, New York has a major historical point of this Underground Railroad. And when I was going to school up at Syracuse University, every single year, the Ku Klux Klan would come up and do a march up in Auburn, New York, for that very purpose, to protest this historical, significance. And what I found to be very interesting was that every year, a small band of people would be in white robes, would be marching downtown Auburn, New York, and much bigger throngs of people would come out and hurl insults, if not other kinds of things like, vegetables or rocks or bottles at the Ku Klux Klan when they're marching, because they were very intolerant of what they perceived as intolerance. Same thing in Georgia, where I'm from Georgia. Did my master's degree at the University of Georgia, and way back then, even several years ago, the Ku Klux Klan from Forsyth County, Georgia, would come and march down in Athens, Georgia. And again, same kind of reaction. They'd have a band of followers, but a larger group of people would turn out in opposition to their marching. So on the one hand, like I said, we've gotten, over time, we've become much more tolerant politically, but at the same time, we still continue to remain fairly intolerant of intolerance, or of those groups that we consider to be very intolerant in their own orientations. Overall, it's because these kinds of beliefs, though, in terms of our political culture, that shape our views of the various types of public policies that we have. So, for example, if we look at public assistance, how do we feel about people on welfare? How we feel about people on welfare, in part, is a reflection of our views that are reflected in our political culture. Let me give you an example of that real quickly. For example, we are willing to help people who are truly in need. For example, those who are disabled or children, we are very willing as a society to help those who are truly in need. But if we see people who are able to take care of themselves, we're not willing to help or express our willingness to help those individuals in terms of the form of public assistance. If you are able-bodied an individual, we don't believe that you should be on public assistance. And again, I think this reflects, again, an underlying belief in the notion of personal responsibility. Unlike other countries, we don't believe that government should automatically guarantee a basic standard of living. That's the idea of equality of results. And when compared to other countries, we have lagged behind in providing for a social welfare system to the same level. Let me just give you one other quick thing here in terms of our basic beliefs, because I'm going to come back to the idea of religion. Does religion shape our political culture? And the answer, of course, is absolutely. Religious beliefs have always played a significant role in American politics. Religious leaders have played an important role in the struggle over slavery and the temperance movement in the early 1900s. There was a group called the Christian Women's Temperance Union trying to eliminate alcohol and the consumption of alcohol from our society. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and the 1960s was led mainly by African American religious leaders, such as Martin Luther King Jr., who was a pastor by training. In the 1980s, we see the rise of the moral majority, and under the direction of Jerry Falwell, advocating constitutional amendments that would require prayer in public schools and that would ban abortion. And more recently, we've seen the influence of groups such as the Christian Coalition trying to influence public policies. Again, for example, a further move toward allowing for prayer in public schools and restricting abortion. Protestantism, especially Puritanism, is ingrained within our culture. This idea of the Protestant work ethic, you have an obligation to work, to save money, to obey the law, and to do these kinds of good works. And that was a sign of your salvation in the life to come. And again, that's part of that ingrained part of our heritage, our historical heritage, based upon our religious training and tradition. Now, what does our political culture suggest about how much we trust government? Do we believe in government? Do we tend to believe that we can't trust government? We've seen some elements to suggest that as well. Certainly over the past several years, we have seen a decline in our view of government. How do we believe, how do we look at government? And do we trust government? We've seen perhaps maybe the biggest drop in the decline in our trust in government between 1972 and 1974. As you remember, what happened is it was associated with the Watergate era, where Nixon authorized the burglary of the break-in at the Democratic Party headquarters, and the president himself participated in the cover-up of that break-in. The trust in government went down significantly during that time, but even since that point in time, press coverage of scandals has deepened our mistrust in government. We think about, for example, the impeachment of President Bill Clinton and the Hurricane Katrina and the fiasco in New Orleans with the government not doing a very good job in helping people in that situation. And then continuing problems that our government still faces and being able to not be able to solve, such as violent crime and drug abuse and things like that. So all these things has contributed to a declining sense of political efficacy in a lot of ways. What seems to have happened is that people have come to believe that government has become too big and too complex for the average citizen to have any impact. So Americans in record numbers have expressed disgust at politics and politicians at the polls. We've seen a resurgence in voting more recently than that, but again, overall there's been a decline. But the point I want to leave you with is this, is that despite the fact that we have come to a certain level of distrust of our leaders, we have not lost faith in our system. We still very much believe in democracy and believe that the democracy that we have under our Constitution is the best democracy in the world. So we still have a very strong and deep abiding faith in our democratic system, although we have developed certainly a very somewhat cynical view of our leaders in light of what we've seen in terms of their behavior over the past 30, 40 years or so. So these are kind of some of the basic issues I want to talk about in terms of the various formations on your political attitudes, the different things that shape public opinion, and also the various types of elements within our political culture. Next time we meet, I want to talk a little bit about voting behavior, different patterns of voting. So we're going to move away from public opinion and agents of political socialization that we talked about today, political culture. Now we're going to move in to talk about how these things actually affect the way we vote. So until next time, this is Patrick Scott. Thank you.